Brad Garrett is joining us. Hi, Brad. How are you, sir?
Good morning, Glenn. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm shocked at the number that there's only 3.7 million Americans that would consider themselves preppers. I would have thought that was at least 5%, 10%.
You know, I think that number is a bit misleading because a lot of people don't want to identify themselves as preppers. So I think that that's a problem with polling,
Right?
Because if you ask people, if you switch that question around, you say, can you survive for 30 days on your own? Like, imagine there's no government infrastructure, water's down, power's down, there's no grocery stores. If you ask people the question that way, then about 11.7 million people say that they can survive for 30 days. So I think it's a problem of labeling. Just like in the past, people didn't want to be called survivalists. People now don't want to be called preppers. It has a kind of,
negative,
taken on a negative connotation for some reason.
It used to just be called self-reliance. Are you self-reliant? Yeah.
Yeah, of course. 150 years ago, everyone was self-reliant.
Right.
We've become increasingly dependent on the state and less dependent on our neighbors, which I think is the bigger problem.
Because I consider myself, actually, I go back and forth. I consider myself a prepper because I'm more prepared than most of my friends. However, I just know there's going to be something like, oh, crap, I forgot batteries. There's going to be something that it all falls apart. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. There's always something. But, this is why I spent a lot of time in Salt Lake City when I was writing my book, Bunker. And the Church of Latter-day Saints up there, they are incredible preppers, and they run through scenarios all the time. So they will, they'll practice an emergency. They'll work through their food stores. They practice calling everyone on their phone chain, making sure their neighbors are available in the event of a disaster. That's what we should all be doing. If you do a dry run, then you realize what you're lacking.
Were you allowed into the tunnels underneath Salt Lake?
No, I tried.
You should have called me. I could have maybe gotten you in. It's incredible.
Let's go back.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible. They have enough food, storage, and everything else for the entire city in case there's a problem. It's really incredible. Really incredible.
That's fantastic. I have to say it was the easiest part of writing my book. A lot of preppers, particularly preppers that are building high-level luxury private bunkers, did not want people to necessarily know where they were or what was inside them. But when I showed up in Salt Lake City, they were open arms for the most part. Just let me into all of their facilities. I saw the canning facilities where they fill those number 10 cans with pasta and oatmeal and everything else, and it was quite a thing. But I didn't make it to the tunnels.
Tell me, since we have had this nuclear warning, it's my understanding that there are countries, Russia is one of them, I think Switzerland is one, I think the United Kingdom is one, where they are going back and looking at their old Cold War bunkers. And in Switzerland, I believe that they're being mandated by government, you've got to go update the food and water in them. Is that true?
That is true, yeah. And it's kind of ironic that the bunkers that were built by the Soviet Union in Ukraine have been sheltering people and saving probably tens of thousands of lives at this point. But that has encouraged the rest of Europe to sort of reassess their position in terms of bunkers. Switzerland is the most protected country on Earth, aside from maybe North Korea, but we have no idea what's going on there, really. So there is space for 102% of the population, which is kind of astounding. They've actually got 300,000 private bunkers inside Switzerland, and then 5,000 public shelters, and most of those are not just fallout shelters, but blast shelters. So those are nuclear, biological, and chemical filtered shelters that the population can take shelter in. And, there's actually enough space that if someone was visiting, the tourists could end up in those bunkers as well.
That is crazy. So where are we on the scale of these Western nations and nations that would be affected by this nuclear threat? Where are we in taking it seriously and as a government and preparing people for it?
Absolutely terrible. I mean, the U.S. and U.K. are probably at the bottom of the list in terms of preparations. And that goes back in the United States to the Cold War. So there was a team of nuclear strategists that included Herman Kahn that thought about what it would take to. He wrote this amazing book on thermonuclear war.
I have a copy of it. It's great.
Absolutely incredible.
Yeah. Nuts.
But he ran these scenarios about what it would take to evacuate the U.S. population into bunkers if there were to be an all-out nuclear exchange, and the cost of construction of those bunkers essentially exceeded GDP of the country for a year. Yeah, so that's why the Kennedy administration, I think it was in '63, Kennedy made this speech where he basically said, it's the responsibility of each person, each family, each community to take preparation upon yourselves. And that's the path that we've been going down since then. And I think what frustrates a lot of Americans is that we now know that as that speech was being made, the government was hard at work constructing bunkers for themselves, for their families, for their aides. So, we have a model in the United States and also in the UK where if you're a politician, if you're a CEO, if you're someone with influence and power, you're probably going to get space in a bunker, but everyone else is left out to dry. And so that has triggered in the United States this incredible movement in the last 10 years or so of private citizens building their own bunkers, and some of these even rival the government bunkers that were built during the Cold War.
So why did you write this book? Are you feeling we're going to need bunkers, or what was your motivation here?
Well, the bunker is really a metaphor for thinking about our deteriorating geopolitical situation, thinking about our deteriorating, social situation within the country.
Right.
When I began writing the book, I was interested in the topic from a sociological perspective. I wanted to know who the private players were that were building these bunkers, what they were worried about, and whether there was any credence to it. And I have, since I wrote the book, purchased a cabin in the woods and a 5-acre ranch. I've got 2 different locations that are connected by a four-wheel drive dirt track, so I can move between them without going on major roads. Most of the people that I spoke to who were serious about their preparations told me that the concerns that they had weren't just speculative, right? That they felt we were on the precipice of something happening. And keep in mind, I started writing this book in 2017. I finished it in 2021. So I had a lot of interviews with people telling me that a pandemic was inevitable, that we were overdue for one, that they happened with regularity every 100 years or so.
Right.
And then it happened. And so that made me go back and reassess all the other things that people were telling me that seemed slightly conspiratorial, or like some kind of magical thinking. And then when I went and reassessed those claims, they seemed to hold a lot more weight than I expected them to.
Yeah. And so you became one of us. Anyway,
I crossed over. No,
sorry about that, Brad.
But I think to your point, we're just going back to an earlier time, or it's taking on a different kind of mindset where you can't just get on Amazon and click a button and get the thing you need tomorrow. You need to have it now because you might not be able to get it when things go wrong. And so, I think it's just a kind of changing up our mindset a little bit to think about what our position might be in the future, and it might be a little more precarious than it is now.
We're talking to Dr. Brad Garrett. He wrote the book Bunker, Building for the End Times. You can follow him at his website, bradleygarrett.com. Back with more in just a minute. I remember I graduated high school in 1982, and my Rights and Responsibilities project was an essay on the preparedness of our school. And I went into our fallout shelter, and it was a joke. I mean, I remember the air was not being filtered. The air was just from a shaft that went right directly outside. Now I can't even imagine, do fallout shelters even exist anymore?
Well, they do. Most of them are in a state of disrepair. A lot of them have been turned into, they've just been adapted for different purposes. There was a national fallout shelter survey that took place in the late 1960s, early 70s, where we identified parking garages, basements, spaces that could be essentially used as a fallout shelter. So imagine, you're 100 miles from a nuclear blast. You would get into this parking garage and wait it out. But most of those spaces, as you say, didn't have any sort of filtration.
Right.
So, you might increase people's possibility of surviving, but you're not assuring anyone is going to survive, really. Now, if you try and look for those fallout shelters, they're hard to find. Of course, the government has continued the theme of protecting themselves. So they have space that they can go to. There's a ring of about 100 bunkers around Washington, D.C. that government officials can be easily whisked away to. That, of course, are stockpiled with food, and they've got EMP shielded communication systems. They're blast shelters, so they could take a direct hit. You can. So we've assured the continuity of government.
But that's about it. Cockroaches and politicians will survive.
Of course they will, yeah. But, the government without its people doesn't mean much, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible thing to imagine. During the Cold War, every city in the United States with over 500,000 people in it had a nuclear warhead aimed at it, ready to fire. I mean, it literally just took someone to press that button, and that city would be obliterated. And it feels like, those nuclear tensions obviously are ramping up again, and we might end up back in that situation where we're thinking seriously about what it would mean to lose D.C., Los Angeles, Boston. But I mean, what would we do? And the answer is the government has a plan, but we don't, for the most part.
So where do you even start on a plan? I mean, people will say, I've got food and water. But if you had something, and it doesn't even have to be a nuclear explosion, you have something where everything has broken down. You have 72 hours to be away from people. Otherwise, after 72 hours, if no help comes, the thing just goes into chaos. And if you're known as the person with the food and everything else, I hope you have strong metal doors.
Right, yeah. I mean, there's a huge debate within the prepper community about bugging out versus bugging in. And it's kind of a rural versus urban debate, because if you're in an urban area, you probably want to get out of there.
Correct.
As you said, the preppers have this saying, 72 hours to animal. It takes about 3 days before people start really falling apart. People will actually, sociological studies have shown that in disaster, their first reaction is to help others.
Right.
And that will carry on for a couple of days until the people who are providing assistance start suffering. And then things start collapsing.
So is it that, or is it that in 72 hours, when help isn't coming, then you start to have the bad guys go, we can take it all. I mean, nobody's coming.
I think it's more of a sense of abandonment. That, once people realize help isn't coming, then you start to turn to yourself and your family. rather than providing assistance to others. And so, what can you do? Well, if we're talking about existential threats, nuclear war, unaligned artificial intelligence destroying us, an EMP that wipes out all of the electronics in the country instantaneously. This isn't really stuff you can prepare for very well.
Right.
And, but what you can prepare for is kind of minor turbulence, I call it.
Right.
The taps turning off or electricity being out for a day or two. Buy a backup generator. Build a go bag that has your passport, your car titles, your birth certificate,
right.
That kind of stuff, and have that ready to grab at a moment's notice. Those are things that everyone can do right now, and it's really it doesn't take much.